Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Invent Your Story with Margaret Brumm. This is part of the PWPL Public Library's summer reading program, Imagine Your Story. And tonight, Margaret is going to talk about some of her favorite inventors. So I'm going to get her screen up and then let her take it away.
Hello, everyone. This is Margaret Brumm. I'm sitting in my car in the PWPL Public parking lot because it seems that's the best way to handle this. I'm delighted you're here tonight. I'm about to introduce you to people who have inspired me and made me feel happy in my chosen profession of patent attorney. They're my favorite inventors, and for some of them you've probably heard of, and some of them you've never heard of. But the reason they're my favorite inventors is the best part of being a patent attorney is when you meet someone and you get a tingle down the back of your neck, and that tingle signals that you're in the presence of a genius. And in my way, when I feel that tingle, I pretty much shut up and just start listening, because when you're in the presence of a genius, you just want to listen. So that's the criteria for being in these slides, is if I encountered these people or their inventions and I got the tingle. And we'll decide at the end if any of these people touch you the same way. First slide, please. Okay, my video just stopped. What happened?
I don't know, but it should still be sharing, and it says, "Why are these my favorite inventors?"
Okay, let's go to the next slide. We got the next slide is a gentleman named John Lloyd Wright. Do you have his picture up?
I do.
And I'm looking for the connector, and no, I'm just not getting the connector. So I'm looking at the slides from my iPad. This gentleman's name is John Lloyd Wright, and yes, he is the son of the famous architect Frank Lloyd Wright, and he, like his father, is a licensed architect, and he worked around the turn of the century, and both he and his father were men who were difficult to get along with, and several times he worked with his father, and then he didn't work with his dad. They kept fighting back and forth, especially over big projects like the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo. So what happened eventually is John Lloyd Wright went off on his own, and next slide, please, created one of the most iconic toys in the history of the United States and in the history of the world. They're still being made. There's a famous Lincoln log. They were created in 1916. They were patented at the time as a building block, a toy. They were one of the first inductees into the National Toy Hall of Fame. And they've always been a favorite toy of mine. Since I was a very young child, we always had Lincoln logs in the house. They always were fun to work with. As an adult, wherever I've been, I've always had Lincoln logs in my house. Some nights when I don't feel like a computer or TV or reading a book, I will dig them out and I will build something, because there's something soothing about building and putting them together. And the creativity of putting them together is always a part of it. And I appreciate the fact that there's many more advanced toys. There's much more electronics toy making. But I think a lot of creativity, especially in a young child, comes from holding it and putting it together and seeing how it fits. And so my Lincoln log is my favorite toy. And my favorite toy inventor is John Lloyd Wright. And it just goes to show you the things that you think you're good about, maybe being an architect, maybe that's not what you're going to be remembered for. So that's my first great inventor. Next slide is Wendell Wayne Catron. This is a gentleman who lives in Illinois, and I was his patent attorney when I worked for DSM Functional Materials in Elgin, Illinois. And the reason he's one of my favorite inventors is he invented the highest selling product for DSM functional materials in Elgin, Illinois. And he did that by creating a secondary coating for optical fiber. You can move the slide up. And the reason that was so important is that optical fiber is how all the communications in the world go on. And the fact is, the optical fiber is glass. And without a good coating on the glass, you're not have a practical way of shoot.
Transferring call.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I apologize. I had a glitch with my phone. A secondary coating goes on top of a primary coating, which goes on top of the glass, which is manufactured about 2,100 meters a second. In other words, you're making a glass fiber the smaller in diameter than a fishing line, and you're coating it with a soft primary coating and then a harder, tougher secondary coating that's cured with ultraviolet light. And this all happens in less than a second. So your primary coating and your secondary coating have to be formulated so that they work well together and work well with the fiber and will protect it for the life of the fiber, which is 20 to 40 years. Now, Wendell invented the secondary coating. And up until Wendell, all the time and effort had been spent on the primary coating, which was the layer that's closest to the glass. But Wendell and I worked on his patent, which is patent number 8734945, and came up with a very long claim. Somehow it came up sideways. I hope you're seeing it clearly. And in this claim, there were 3 different components of the coating: alpha, beta, and gamma oligomers. And when the oligomers are hit with ultraviolet light, they turn into polymers, which instantly solidify the coating. And the reason Wendell is on this list is because each oligomer has multiple ingredients that go into making it. So when you think about what he had to figure out, it wasn't just 1, 2, or 3 oligomers. It was each oligomer between 7 and 14 ingredients went into it. And when he was done, he had to know how each ingredient would interact with the oligomer and with the other ingredients, because when he was making the oligomers, there'd be leftover materials. So figure 7 ingredients in one, 14 in another, maybe another 10, 20 upwards of 20 ingredients with leftovers in the final product had to work. And it had to work in the sense that these coatings are so sensitive, some residual polyol, which is a type of chemistry, can cause the entire coating to fail by interacting negatively with the primary coating. So my respect for Wendell is when he sat down with me and started going through everything in the coatings and how they all interacted with each other, I just shut up and listened. He was fantastic. And in his being fantastic, he taught me everything about secondary coatings. And then when he was able to do, they had never had a secondary coating as good as his. So between the primary coating and the secondary coating, it was the top of the line product for this company for many years, and it made them hundreds of millions of dollars. And when you look at Wendell in this picture, he just looks like a regular guy with a beard and glasses. My favorite Wendell story is he was hunting and shot a big buck, decided to do at-home taxidermy. And then the first thing you do is you put the bones in the sunlight to dry off the flesh so you can remount the fur. And he was too cheap to go to a real taxidermist, so he put the head of the deer way up on a baseball hoop to try to dry it out in the sun. Came to work one day and he was all sad. And I said, "What's the matter, Wendell?" He said, "Well, I should have known better, but when I put the deer head up there, I forgot about the turkey vultures." So this very smart man who can create a coating with upwards of 30 ingredients forgot that a turkey vulture can smell anything that's dead. And so a turkey vulture came down and stole his head with the antlers, and he never did get to make the taxidermy of it. Nevertheless, he did make the best-selling coating for DSM functional materials for 10 years. And it was a privilege, an absolute privilege to work with the man. Okay, The next inventor is Otto Frederick Rohwedder. You never heard of him, but you use his product every day. His product is sliced bread. He was trained as an engineer, and he also did work as a jeweler. And you'll find that people who are trained in jewelry often end up making inventions. For example, the Field Museum employs a lot of people who are trained in jewelry making to put together statues of animals because they have the fine motor skills and they know how things fit together. Well, Otto was in many different businesses, but he ended up making the first commercial bread slicing machine. And if you think that's not a big deal, before Otto, if you wanted bread from a baker, you bought it, took it home and sliced it, and you never got the same thickness of bread. And many times, if your knife wasn't sharp enough, you tore into the bread and messed it up, so you had a mess. Well, Otto figured out a mechanical way at the bakery for them to put the slicing done in the bakery and then put the bread directly into a piece of plastic so that when you got it home, you had the same thickness of each piece of bread. And that was revolutionary, very rare to have a patent about food because so much has been done in the art of food. And then following Otto's work on the toaster, there's a tremendous increase in the sales of mechanical electric toasters. So not only did he change the world with sliced bread, he changed the market for toasters. And I think about him every time I put a piece of toast in our toaster at home. And I think I wouldn't much like to have to set up a separate oven rack, which is how they used to make toast, or a separate vertical toaster that took forever and burned up everything as it went. So his invention is so important to history, the original ones in the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. And he also, in addition to making the bread slicing equipment, it was such a revolution that the phrase, "It's the greatest thing since sliced bread," happened after he invented his slicer. When you think about it, that phrase, "It's the greatest thing since sliced bread," actually meant something. It meant that it impacted as many people as slicing bread in the bakery. Okay, the next inventor, if any of you have HBO, there was just a TV series on Madam C.J. Walker. She is one of my all-time favorite people because she had absolutely no one encouraging her or telling her she could be great, and she found her greatness inside herself. She was born Sarah Breedlove. She was born the child of former slaves. Both of her parents died when she was very, very young. She went to live with one of her sisters and a brother-in-law who was very cruel to her. Ended up marrying, like 12 or 13 years old was her first marriage. Immediately had a daughter. First husband died. She was making pennies a day as a washerwoman and then as a cook or cook's helper. And what she wanted to be was a great lady because she worked in households where the best and the brightest of society worked. And instead of working as a washerwoman, she wanted to wear nice clothes and be a great lady. So what she figured out with the help of her brothers was different types of hair treatment for African-American females. At the time, people were just starting to do hair treatment, but nobody was focusing on African-American females. And she focused on that type of hair and the special challenges. There was a lot of issues with hair care products involving nutrition, diet, exercise, all the things. People lived very difficult manual labor jobs, which was very, very hard on their hair. And her products worked. And not only did they work, she convinced other ladies to help her sell her products by going door to door and washing people's hair with these special products. And so she built up her business to where it was huge and ended up settling in Indianapolis with her then third husband, who's named Charles J. Walker. And she started to call herself Madam C.J. Walker to have a name befitting her position. She started the company, owned the company, ran the company.
Just one.
I'm sorry, is somebody talking? Hello?
Go ahead, just continue, Margaret.
Okay. So Madam C.J. Walker was one of my favorite inventors. She didn't succeed in getting a patent for any of her inventions, but she did get several trademarks. And the trademarks had to do with using her image on the outside of the container for her products. And that image is still online. You can see it several places. She was very, very savvy to marketing and how to get her product out to people. And she took advantage of the lack of other products in the hair care field. And she ended up with competitors, and they tried to say that she wasn't the first, but she definitely was the best. You go to the next slide. The name of her company, Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company, lasted over 75 years before it was absorbed by one of the other beauty companies. And that's a good length of time for a company to run, especially after the death of the founder. So what she did very well. She was a female inventor, founder of a business. She was the first self-made female millionaire in the U.S. at a time when women, let alone women, African-American women, were not part of the mainstream of business. She excelled. There's a great picture of her in an automobile with 3 of her friends, and they're all dressed up as fancy ladies are, and she just looks gorgeous. So everything she was selling and everything she was telling people about worked great. And they just now rediscovered her. She got a stamp in 1998. She got a TV series on HBO in the last 6 months. I found her when I was doing speeches for 5th graders, and she is definitely someone to be in awe of, what she was able to do at a time when no one, I'm just going to make a statement, no one would give her a break. She was able to do tremendous amounts of work. Okay, this next one, Sir David Brewster, is connected with 2 inventors who are in modern times. David Brewster was a famous scientist in Britain about the time of the first Industrial Revolution. He is focused on physical optics. He's written treatises. He's done a tremendous amount of work in understanding light and bending of light. And the reason we remember him is he was the inventor of the toy kaleidoscope. And a kaleidoscope is a tube with a bunch of prisms of glass inside. And when you turn the end of the tube, you get a different pattern every time you turn the glass. And everybody here has played with a kaleidoscope. Since they were first invented in the early 1800s, they've never gone off sale. They're one of these toys that continues forever and ever. And in fact, when they first came out, when he first invented them, all the British school kids who were away at school came home, and they all wanted their parents to buy them a kaleidoscope because one kid at school had gotten one. So it was the rage to have a kaleidoscope. Unfortunately, David Brewster was more of a scientist than an entrepreneur. So he got a patent on his kaleidoscope, but he chose not to enforce it. And within 2 months of creating the kaleidoscope, there were rip-offs all over Europe. They weren't as good as his, but the kaleidoscope was very popular, and he's the creator of it. And his optical discussions were written down as the basis for the kaleidoscope, but at that time, nobody much cared. It was just a kid's toy. Well, then you move on. He named it after 3 Greek words, a beautiful form and IC. So he had something of a poet about him. And then I've taken a picture. I could have taken any number of pictures. We're on the slide with the blue image of the kaleidoscope. And you can see how pretty they are. You've all played with them. They can have any number of patterns. But in a kaleidoscope, all of the optics are on the inside, and you're looking at a picture generated from the inside of the tube. So, story of the patent is there. 200,000 kaleidoscopes. It was the biggest rage. He never got any money for it. Now you go to the slide entitled a kaleidoscope. It's a kind of kaleidoscope with a lens and an open view, but it forms the image from outside the instrument. In other words, when you turn the image, you're looking outside, not inside. And you still get a really interesting pattern, and it's still a children's toy. It's just it was invented in the 1970s by two gentlemen, John Lyon Burnside III and Harry Hay. And they patented their invention. And the next slide is a picture of John Burnside III. He's a very modern man. They invented the kaleidoscope based on the original kaleidoscope from Sir David Brewster in terms of the optics. They understood the optics. And John Burnside was a really savvy inventor. And he figured out a way to include the original optics from Sir Brewster's kaleidoscope in his patent for the kaleidoscope, which means in the 1900s, he was collecting royalties every time somebody manufactured a kaleidoscope in the United States. He figured out a way to bring back that optical information and put it in his patent. And that's why these two groups of inventors just are my favorites. One gentleman was a very serious optical physicist, and he's remembered for a children's toy, which is, I think in the world of life, a good children's toy is always better remembered. But his genius was he wrote down his math, and these two gentlemen found his math and figured out the kaleidoscope and figured out a way to profit because they got it patented. They made a ton of money. And interestingly enough, they are very much involved in the gay rights movement in San Francisco, and they use their money to help finance some of the activities for the gay rights movement. So there's all sorts of connections in life amongst inventors where you wouldn't expect them to be connected, and yet they are. And these two groups are connected. I have both a kaleidoscope and a tachydoscope. And I got to tell you, if you don't already have a kaleidoscope, go on Amazon or go to a store and get one. Because when you look down a kaleidoscope and turn it around, you kind of nod your head. And then you look out through a kaleidoscope and you look out and say, I've never seen anything like that. And so it's two inventors working together across the centuries. And the last picture there, that tube with the bubble at the end, that's a kaleidoscope. I have about 5 of them, and they all, they're just fun to play with. It's just as simple as that. Okay, the next inventor is Vivian Thomas, and if there was a TV show on him, I think it was called Something the Lord Made. His story was like Madam C.J. Walker, only even more extraordinary. He had always wanted to be a doctor. He was in school to be a doctor doing pre-med work, and the Depression hit, and he was desperate for work, so he signed on as a laboratory technician at a hospital down south. And the gentleman he ended up working for was a very eccentric doctor who was doing research work on dogs. And so Vivian Thomas became the gentleman who came in every day, got the dog out, got him ready for surgery, and then assisted the doctor in doing the experimental surgery on the dogs. Very, very quickly, Vivian Thomas's work exceeded what the doctor had done. In fact, Thomas worked on internal procedures for the heart because at that time, no surgeon successfully operated on the heart. There was kind of a taboo in the medical community about operating on the heart, since the heart is the centerpiece of all humankind. And these two gentlemen, Thomas and the other man, who I'm not going to mention, because while his teacher was alive, he never mentioned Thomas. And they got a lot of success for the surgical procedure that Vivian Thomas invented on treating blue baby syndrome, which has to do with babies being born with their heart plumbing misconnected, so that the oxygenated blood wasn't getting out to the organs, so there were blue babies. That's what they were called. Well, Thomas figured out a way to reconnect the pipes so that those blue babies could again breathe. And he, in fact, worked out this system on dogs. And during the first time they tried it on a human, his mentor did the actual surgery based on what Thomas told him to do. And the first surgery was partially successful. The second one was completely successful. And the third one was fantastic. And so Thomas's mentor became famous for doing this blue baby surgery, and it was really Thomas who invented it. And he didn't get any of the credit for being part of the team. He wasn't in any of the pictures. He basically was employed as a laboratory technician, and he ended up being the surgical instructor for this blue baby syndrome. And time went on, and his mentor went north to Johns Hopkins University and brought Thomas along with him and made him the highest paid laboratory assistant in the building, but he was still a lab assistant at a time when African Americans were very scarce in medical, especially in the prestigious medical hospitals. And after a while, Vivian Thomas took over a lot of the teaching that his mentor was supposed to be doing, and he taught generations of surgeons how to do heart surgery, all the while being employed as a laboratory assistant. He was actually being a surgical instructor. At night, when he needed more money, he would be hired by his mentor to be a bartender at a party at his mentor's house. So during the day, he was a surgical instructor, and at night, he was a bartender. And I don't have any respect for the guy he worked for, so I'm not naming him, because he took advantage of Thomas's work, and it worked, but he didn't give him any credit. And to the credit of the people that Thomas trained, after Thomas's mentor finally left this earth, they got together and had a picture of him done. This is the picture in the slide, and presented it to Johns Hopkins University. And they got Johns Hopkins University to award him an honorary doctorate so he could finally be called doctor. You see, he'd always wanted to go to medical school, and after he got successful with his mentor, he looked into going to medical school. But the people in the medical profession wouldn't give him any credit for the work he did in the lab, so he would have had to start all over again. It would have taken him 8 years to become a doctor. He would have been at 50 years old, and at that time, 50 years old was almost retirement age. So much to Thomas's regret, he never got to go to medical school, but he spent the last 10 years of his life as an instructor teaching surgical techniques to medical students when he himself had never graduated from college or medical school. But his students came through for him. They got him a portrait, and they also made sure that people knew it was his greatness and not the other guy's greatness that got this procedure done. And Johns Hopkins, after Thomas left this world, named one of the 4 groupings of surgical students each year after him. They took 4 doctors named, and his group is Dr. Thomas's group. And this is another example of someone, it's not just a tingle down the back of my neck, what this guy had to go through to be part of all of this great work and know you're the one responsible for it and not be acknowledged or given credit is tremendously difficult. But to stick it out long enough because you know you're helping people and making things better is just fantastic. And then in the long run, his students came through for him, which means he was a good teacher and a good man, because I can tell you there's a lot of teachers I've had I wouldn't pay any attention to once I didn't have to. And his teachers came through for him, not his mentor. So anytime you think something is impossible, take a look at the picture of Vivian Thomas and realize he started as a laboratory technician and ended up teaching open heart surgery to generations of medical students. Yeah, he's one of my favorites. Okay, the next gentleman is an Englishman, Sir Bernard Lee, and his claim to fame is he made the internet accessible to everyone. And this is where a little bit of history on the internet. Most people know that the beginnings of connecting personal computers came about through what was called ARPA, the Advanced Research Project Association of various colleges out in the Western United States. And then that group got funding from the Defense Department, so ARPA became DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Project Administration. And originally it was a private connection of different computers at different universities doing defense work. Well, eventually DARPA became the internet. And it became the internet at a time when the technology and personal computers was getting to the point where everybody could have one. But it was this gentleman, Sir Bernard Lees, that created the protocols for transferring information on the internet, the World Wide Web pages, and the links in the World Wide Web so you could click from one page to another. And he's one of my favorites because everyone takes the computer for granted, and the people who started in ARPA and DARPA didn't worry about the general public doing it because they didn't have to. They were all scientists and engineers, and they were brilliant. But this gentleman, Sir Bernard Lee, figured out how to communicate amongst the general public. And that's much harder to do than talk among scientists and engineers. And his contributions, hypertext, HTTPS, hypertext text transfer protocol, things like that didn't exist without him. And the more I read about him, you can't put the internet on any one person or any one group. I once did a presentation about 40 slides of the different people who contributed to the internet. This is the gentleman who made the internet accessible to people so that we can sit here and talk to each other. And that's why he's one of my favorites. And he also apologized for the double click being necessary to do certain things, which I thought was very nice of him. So that's Sir Bernard Lee. Now, we're getting to the inventor that is my all-time favorite inventor. The first exhibit in the British Science Museum is called James Watt and Our World, and it goes back to the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain. And you would think that there's something else would start the British Science Museum, something more modern. But I walked into the British Science Museum for the first time in July of 2011, and I walked in through this exhibit and saw James Watt, who I knew invented the steam engine, and I got the tingle down the back of my neck. And I got it, and it stayed with me all the while I was going through the exhibit, and I was amazed because it's hard for me to connect with someone who's not part of my timeline, but so much of what he did was so modern and so necessary, and how we did it and how we went about doing it changed so much of how inventions are invented and patented. And I always knew he fixed the steam engine, but I never knew how he'd gone about doing it. So the first exhibit is James Watt and Our World. The second slide is me holding up James Watt's 3-page patent. I'm actually inside his workshop at the British Science Museum. I'm there with permission, and that's another story. But they have his entire workshop there, and the first time I saw it, it was behind glass protective walls. And I made it one of my goals to get inside that room. I didn't know how I was going to do it, but I wanted to get inside that room because that was all the stuff from his workshop. When he died, they closed up his workshop and didn't touch it for close to 100 years. And they finally packed it all up and shipped it to the Science Museum. And the gentleman who did the packing wanted to know if the Science Museum wanted the dust from the floor of the exhibit. And Science Museum decided they didn't quite need the dust, but they were very grateful it was offered to them. So how did I get behind the scenes at the British Science Museum? There's a picture of a gentleman smiling, wearing a blue lanyard with an identity card. His name is Ben Russell. He is the curator of mechanical exhibits at the British Science Museum. He is a world expert on James Watt. He is the guy that people from all over the world call whenever an issue with James Watt comes up, because if you go to the next slide, he literally wrote the book on James Watt, which is on sale in the British Science Museum gift shop. And after my 2011 visit to the museum, I got and read every book on James Watt I could. And when I found Ben Russell's book, I read the book and I looked him up and I thought, oh my, this gentleman is alive now and he's part of the museum. So before my trip in 2017 to London, because I go to London every other year for business, I emailed Ben Russell at the British Science Museum and introduced myself and asked if I could meet with him for an hour to talk about James Watt. And he was nice enough to agree to meet with me. And when I got there, I showed him a copy of his own book, and he thought that was interesting. And then if you see the page of the book, I've got his autograph on his copy of the book, dated July 5th, 2017. And we had a very, very pleasant visit in the cafeteria at the British Science Museum, talking about James Watt and the exhibit. And I explained to him how I used James Watt as an example of the world's greatest inventor, because he and his partner, Matthew Boulton, changed the Industrial Revolution with Watt's invention, but they also changed British patent law, which changed global patent law, and did it at a time when most people didn't even know how valuable patents were. So we had a very pleasant meeting. I'm very sure he was surprised to listen to an American talk so enthusiastically about James Watt. It was very obvious I was sincere, and everything he brought up about Watt, I was able to nod my head and participate in the conversation. So as we were wrapping up our meeting, he mentioned casually the next time I was in town to let him know, and he would make sure I'd get a behind-the-scenes tour of the exhibit. So in 2019, in October 2019, I got to go to the British Science Museum, and I got to go behind the scenes. The next picture is of me in James Watt's workshop, and the back of my neck is tingling at warp speed, because the closer I got to the exhibit, the more I realized I was looking and touching things that had been touched by James Watt. In the cubby holes and the shelves of his workshop were half-finished experiments and chemicals and things he was working on up until the day he died. And the Science Museum has kept everything intact. Ben told me that when he gets time, he opens the drawers and photocopies what's inside each piece of paper. Watt kept a whole bunch of work he had done on a copy machine for letters. And this is something most people don't know, is that James Watt invented a workable copy machine over 100 years before xerography, which is the current copy machine technology, was invented. And we're going to talk about the steam engine, but I'll take a side tour now into the copy machine. What happened in Watt's time is if you wrote a letter to someone else and mailed it, like asked them 10 questions, the person who wrote back to you would answer your questions, but you wouldn't have a copy of your letters, so you wouldn't remember what questions you'd asked him. So men of letters, men who wrote a lot of letters, traditionally employed a secretary to make copies of all their letters so they would have a copy when their response came in. And this was problematic because copies tend to have errors in them. Plus, secretarial work like that is incredibly tedious. And plus, you have to work with another person and pay them. What James Watt did was invent a type of coating for paper, basically chose a special type of paper, soaked it in the coating, and when a person was done writing a letter, they took the letter and placed it face down on this special paper that had been soaked in a coating and ran it through a press, and the special ink they used that Watt created transferred from the letter to the copy page. And it transferred backwards, but all you had to do to read the letter was turn it over, and you could see the letter you had just written. So in other words, you didn't have to employ a secretary, and you didn't have to worry about transcription errors because you got back your very own letter. And he created the ink, he created the coating, and he selected the paper that people used. And to give you an idea how valuable this copy machine was, George Washington had one. Thomas Jefferson had one. All the great men of letters who did a lot of correspondence had these copy machines, and they were in use well into the 20th century until the first mimeograph machines started to come about. They were still used in industry. And what stopped them from being used was carbon paper, typewriting, which made it easier to make copies. And the first mimeograph machines which predated the first Xerox copy machines. But when I learned about Watt having not just, invented a way to improve the steam engine, but also inventing this copy machine, I just was flabbergasted. My whole career of inventing and watching people invent, I'd never heard about Watt being inventor of a copy machine too. So, as I said, Ben Russell shared with me the little cubby holes in the lab. If you pull one open, there'll be a recipe for an improved ink or an improved coating. Watt never stopped working on improving that. Okay, now why is James Watt my favorite inventor? This is the slide where the picture of the dog is on the right. It's where I try to convince people to listen to me. It's just, he's the only inventor where I've stood in a museum watching what the inventor did and got the tingle down the back of my neck. Now, it's odd when I say that because I certainly wasn't expecting to get that reaction to someone who'd been gone for so long. But the more I saw what he had done, the more I was amazed. He changed manufacturing and he changed patent law forever. The slide entitled "What Went Wrong," what he was up against: he had poor health from worry, daily headaches, pinched nerves, and a nervous disposition. He didn't enjoy people. He was brought up by a downer of a father who kept him worrying constantly about failure. And he lost his mother while he was still in his teens, so he didn't have a very nurturing, supporting home life. Wasn't very good with people. He had no money except for what he was paid for, thus he was working all the time. His first wife, who he'd known since childhood, died very young. And his first partner died, leaving him with no source of capital, so he had to keep working on the improvement to the steam engine, and at the same time he was working as a surveyor, which is not work he enjoyed, but he had to do it because it kept money coming in. So what went right with James Watt? He was one of these gentlemen who had magic fingers in the sense he could fix just about anything that was broken. That's how he made his living when he was starting out. He started out as an instrument repair person, and the faculty at the college in Edinburgh got a gift from a guy in the Caribbean of a whole bunch of scientific instruments. By the time they arrived at the university, they were broken and not in working order. So Watt was hired to fix those instruments. He did a fantastic job. So the university hired him to work in their instrument shop, and that got around the fact that guilds wouldn't let him practice as an instrument person because he'd walked away from his apprenticeship in England after only 1 year. And they insisted on a 7-year apprenticeship, and he just didn't have the money and didn't have the time. And he got out of England as fast as he could because he was worried about getting caught by the press gangs who would take any able-bodied man and put him in the Navy. And a man like Watt, who had all these skills with instruments and delicate work, the Navy would have never let him go. So he got out of England, went back to Scotland, and worked for the university as an instrument maker. He also made and repaired musical instruments, even though he couldn't play an instrument, didn't like music. In fact, he made an organ once because a church wanted an organ. He didn't know how to do it, but he went and saw a bunch of other organs, got a book on it, and made a beautiful organ. He added one thing to it, though, a pedal to make it sound softer, because when he went to church, he couldn't stand loud music. So he was just one of these gentlemen who starts off fixing things, and whenever he saw something, he would try to fix it, even if other people thought it was working okay. And while he was working as an instrument person at the university in Scotland, he could listen to the great scientific minds talk about these problems. It's kind of like an education in and of itself, even though he wasn't technically a student. Imagine working all day fixing messes and at the same time learning as much as you can. What went right? At the time of James Watt's work on the steam engine, there was an existing steam engine called the Newcomen engine. It had been in operation probably 50 years. It worked, but it worked very badly. It wasn't very energy efficient. steam was put into one chamber to be heated, and it stayed in that chamber to be cooled, and it lost a lot of energy being heated and cooled in the same chamber. Watt figured out if you had a separate condenser to cool the steam, you would improve the efficiency and power of the steam engine. In other words, his invention worked. It was that simple. He had a separate condenser. And when I say a separate condenser is simple, when you see it, it makes sense. But until Watt did it, nobody knew how to do it. And it made such sense he had to hire special metalworking people to create the separate condenser. And there was nobody with the skill set to do that at the time. So what he did was hire a cannon maker to make a cannon tube and then seal it at both ends with a pipe at both ends for the condenser. And this was, again, an example of great inventors have to often go to other people and say, I need you to make this for me. And the other person says, well, we don't make that. And the inventor says, yeah, but I need you to make it. And that's what happened with his condensers. So he creates this improvement in efficiency in a steam engine and goes to get a patent on it. And his partner dies. He's broke. He's lost his first wife. He's trying to make a living as a surveyor, can't work on his engine. And that's when he partners with a man called Matthew Boulton. And Boulton wasn't an inventor per se. He was a businessman, and he basically sold whatever he could to whoever would buy it. And he was kind of a con man in the sense he was selling decorative figures to the new middle class in England. And there was a figure called ormolu, which was gold and mercury mixed together in an amalgam and put on a statue. And if you had one of these in your house, you were fancy. But he found that he could make it, the ormolu, great in his factory in England, but that it didn't sell that well because it was from England and it wasn't viewed to be as classy as the ormolu coming from France. So Boulton being Boulton, he made his ormolu in England, shipped it to an agent in France who repackaged it, reboxed it, labeled it in the French language, put product of France on it, and shipped it right back to Boulton. And then Boulton could advertise that he had the best ormolu fresh from France, you know, the greatest of the greatest, and sell it at even more advanced prices. Boulton understood people the way Watt understood how to fix things. So when Watt and Boulton teamed up, it was a fantastic partnership because each one had his own skill set and they each could provide what the other couldn't provide. Watt could invent and Boulton could market. They got a third man in who did the actual installation work in the field as well. It's another example of how there's great inventors, but when we remember people, it's because they worked out with other people who helped make their inventions a success. And this is like Vivian Thomas and his students who reminded everybody, he taught them how to be a great surgeon. Madam C.J. Walker and her ladies who worked for her selling hair care products. It's very, very rare for an inventor to say they did it all on their own. And even if they do the first part on their own, even Wendell at DSM created the coating, but he turned it over to John Zimmerman and his crew to do the manufacturing specs for that coating. And other people, Clive Cody was the marketer for that coating. So great inventors invent, and then we remember them when they team up with other people to do the work. So what went right? They got a patent on a method of improvement of the efficiency of fire engines. And that sounds so simple, but that's the patent that changed the world. Because up until Boulton and Watt, you only patented inventions that were like devices, like a tire or a chair or a carriage or something like that. And he could have patented his steam engine as a steam engine per se. But he very quickly realized if he patented it just as a steam engine, somebody could come along and use their ideas of a separate condenser and re-rig the piping in certain ways to avoid the patent. And he would have lost the royalties for that. So instead of filing a patent with a claim to the steam engine per se, They filed a patent with the claim to a method of improving the efficiency of fire engines. And later on in my slides, I show you how they worked on the royalties. But they did this at a time when no person had filed a method claim. It was always on the mechanical arts. So they had no idea if the claim would be viewed enforceable, but they knew it was a much more valuable claim than just a claim to the engine. So they got the patent in 1769, and the invention really wasn't ready to be commercial, but Bolton lobbied influential members of the British Parliament and got an extension on the patent in 1775, so it was enforced till 1800, 31 years. That's another thing, reason we remember James Watt. Typically now a patent lasts from 20 years from the date of filing. His patent lasted 31 years. So for 31 years, if you were going to work in steam engines with a separate condenser, you had to pay Watt and Bolton a royalty, or they would take you to court. They were famous for taking people to court. And when they took people to court, they won. And if you look at the slide that shows the first page of Watt's patent, new invented method of lessening the consumption of steam and fuel in fire engines, the phrase, "To all to whom these presents shall come, I, James Watt of Glasgow in Scotland, merchant, send greeting." Later on, it changed to I, James Watt of Glasgow, I, James Watt of Birmingham in England, engineer, send greeting. But at this time, he was still in Glasgow, and he still called himself a merchant. He thought he'd be selling engines. And the next paragraph is all about His Majesty King George and the dominions of Great Britain, England, Wales, and the town of Berwick-upon-Tweed. Berwick-upon-Tweed is a little town that never quite joined England and never quite left Scotland and never quite joined the United Kingdom. And so in order to cover the patent rights there, they had to name Berwick-upon-Tweed. Also, in order to cover the North American continent, they had to cover the colonies. Remember, this is 1769. It's before the American Revolution. Interestingly enough, when the American Revolution happened, Watt and Bolton lost a fortune in royalties in the Americas because there was no patent law in America till 1793. And so for all that time, the Watt and Bolton patent didn't apply. There was no patent coverage in America, which is an interesting sideline of the Revolution, is that even though the Constitution required a patent office, it didn't go into effect until the 1790s. And that meant that during this time, people could copy Watt's work in America, which is interesting. Anyway, the first page is talking about the letters patent. The second page, the method claiming provided a royalty based on the amount of fuel saved by using the more efficient Watt engine. Absolutely brilliant claiming. As I said, if they had just done it with drawings showing how they put the engine together, within 5 years' time, somebody would have come up with a different way of putting the engine together, and they would have lost all those royalties. But what they came up with instead was a method of claiming the improvement in efficiency by having a separate condenser. And that meant no matter how you hooked up the condenser to the engine, you still owed them a royalty. Absolutely brilliant claiming. And when they sued people, the people responded with, you know, my lords, this is not a legal claim. There is no precedent in English law for this to be a legal claim. And the law courts had to decide, and they finally decided there was no reason why the patent law couldn't support a method claim in addition to a mechanical claim. And so Watt and Bolton changed UK patent law forever. And because they changed UK patent law, they changed American patent law. And because of this change, all the other countries allow method claiming as well. Now, you have to be a patent attorney to appreciate how valuable a method claim is. A method claim is for a method of accomplishing something. Right now, I work in a lot of chemicals that are used in different oil and gas applications. A lot of the chemicals were invented for another use, so they're already known. But the method of using that chemical in oil and gas has never been tried, and so it's new and it's patentable. And it's very valuable as well, because oil and gas requires new methods of treatment as the original wells run out of oil. So method claiming that started with Watt and Bolton continues to this day. Very valuable claims. And the next slide, Bolton and Watt, the third page of Watt's patent. If you want to talk about the tingle down the back of my neck, Watt and Bolton changed the world and patent law in 3 pages of text. I have written patent applications in the pharmaceutical arts, 178 pages, with page and page and page of examples, and over 150 claims. They changed the world in a 3-page document with 6 claims. That, my friend, is elegance beyond imagining. When you really know what you're talking about and know how to do it, you can make it very short and very simple, and other people will understand it. When I talk to 5th graders, we go through Watt's patent, and we read the first line about I, James Watt, merchant of Glasgow, send thee greetings to let people know Watt's work still reverberates throughout the patent world. And then I get to the end and we talk about money. Earn an annual royalty based on 1/3 of the value of fuel saved in that year. Cost of fuel normally used, 1,000 pounds. Cost of fuel used after Watt engine installed, 250. Fuel savings, 750. Annual royalty, 250 pounds to Watt and Bolton. So you're the person who installs a Watt designed engine. You save $750 in fuel savings, and you have to give 250 pounds of that to Watt and Bolton, and you still save 500 pounds. So yes, it was a very tough royalty, but the person who paid it was still making more money than he did before. So it's the reason why you get a patent is to make money. And the fact is, having this patent made Watt and Bolton incredibly wealthy men of their day. This is probably my most favorite slide. Is James Watt was the most modern inventor. He sued everybody, and I mean everybody, who came up with another design for a separate condenser engine. And he sued, all the while knowing they didn't know if the court would uphold the validity of a method claim. But by Lord, they would not let anybody off the hook. And so many people paid because they didn't want to be sued. And in the long run, the people who were sued argued, as I said before, that there simply was no precedent in the law for a method claim. And what happened then was that the law changed. And after Watt and Bolton got a hold of it, the law changed so that people could write method claims. And that meant more opportunities for royalties. So this gentleman here, Hornblower, Hornblower and his brother infringed Watt's patent, and Watt did not appreciate it, and he christened the pair the Horned Imps of Satan. That's another thing about James Watt. He was an incredibly modern inventor. He took infringement of his patent personally, and he and Bolton just went after everybody, and I mean everybody who came near his patent, and sued them, and they won, and they kept on winning. And these lawsuits went on the length of the patent, and by the time they were done being settled, Watt and Bolton were set up for life. And the last slide in the presentation, though, I'm going to go on a little bit more about favorite inventors. If you go to England now, they just redid all their paper money and made it into plastic money, which is really kind of a cool idea. It's much more durable than paper money. But on the 50-pound note, on the back of that note, Bolton and Watt are the two people focused on that note. They both got their picture there. You cannot have success with Watt as a solo inventor without Bolton's marketing genius and financial support. And without Watt as an inventor, you can't have Bolton being successful, because this was a man who just relabeled existing products and sold them as something else. But when Bolton first met Watt, he realized he had the real thing to sell. And somebody said, "What is the value of an engine?" And he said, and I quote, "Sir, I am selling power." That improvement in efficiency in engines was the beginning of improvement that fueled the Industrial Revolution, because his engines not only pumped the water out of the mines, which was their first use, but Watt found a way to transmit up and down motion into rotary motion, which allowed other equipment to be run, which caused textile manufacturing and coinage machines to be able to run by those engines. Those fired up the Industrial Revolution to the point that when they came up with a new grist mill that was run by a Watt engine, it was so much more efficient than the existing grist mills, which invariably were run by a water wheel, so they all had to be next to river. While a Watt engine running a grist mill could be done anywhere. This grist mill took over the business of grinding grain in that entire area of England, to the point where they came to work one day and were told that there'd been a terrible fire at the grist mill and it had burned to the ground. And the reason they couldn't put the fire out is someone had broken all the pipes leading to the river that they could have brought water up in. In other words, like the workers in France who were upset about being replaced by machinery, who threw their wooden shoes into the manufacturing equipment, thus turning the term sabot, which is a wooden shoe, sabotage, which is to break something. Watt and Bolton were successful in grain making, and so successful that their competitors burned down their factory. And that's another example of an inventor that's changing the world, when your invention is so revolutionary that you have to burn it down to stop the competition, to stop it from taking over the entire situation. That is James Watt and Matthew Bolton. And there's a lot of talk these days about how we should pay more attention to forgotten inventors, and I agree. The Vivian Thomases, the Madam C.J. Walkers, the other inventors who for a lot of reasons were lost to history should be remembered. But by no means should we forget the basic inventors of history, because without them our world would be incredibly different, and incredibly different in a bad way. So these are the inventors that bring me great joy. I love sharing stories about them. I have many, many more stories about Watt and Bolton, but I've been talking now for over a solid hour, and I'm hoping somebody will have some questions. So Carolyn, I'm ready to take questions.
Okay, does anybody have any questions for Margaret? You can go ahead and unmute if you'd like. Well, it doesn't look like we have any questions, Margaret.
That's okay. I'm glad that people cared enough to listen. If you have any questions later on, I can be reached on Facebook, Margaret Brumm. I can also be reached on email, mickybrumm@aol.com. Carolyn can reach me on the phone. I'm hoping you enjoyed this. It's more difficult than I thought it would be, because I can't see your faces, and I love to read the audience and see what you're most interested in. But I hope and pray that you enjoyed this and got something out of it, because I always love talking about inventors who I love. The next speech I'm giving is the end of July, and this one is going to be even more interesting, because it's going to be inventors I hate and why I hate them. And I'm sure that it will change your opinion of me and change your opinion of some of these people, because I will tell you stuff about inventors like Edison and Bell and Steve Jobs that you never heard from anyone else, and you might change your view of them. So that'll be interesting too. Thanks for coming.
Okay, well, thank you, Margaret. And if people want to unmute themselves, we can give you a round of applause. And I just want to say we had a note on chat from Lynn that says fantastic presentation. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Appreciate your time, and everybody. I guess we're going to record this. It's going to be available on Facebook, and I hope we'll get some interest in it. But thank you for your time. Appreciate it, Carolyn.
No, you're welcome. Thank you.
Good night.